Welcome. But to a new video. Let's start with today's story, which is very interesting, and you're going to learn about something I believe you've never heard of. I will now share an experience that Leonardo Rodriguez, a senior officer of the Argentine Naval Prefecture, lived through. This man, originally from the town of Diamante in Entre Rios, was during his professional career in 18 destinations throughout the naval jurisdiction all over Argentina. Leonardo began his studies and attended for 3 years at the prefecture school in Zárate, Buenos Aires. It was here that he graduated as an officer and assistant in the year 1990, and after taking a navigation orientation, he was transferred to his first operational unit, Prefecture to Santo Tome in Corrientes. And this is where today's story is going to begin. It was already 1992, and Leonardo was in this unit that is right on the border with Brazil, São Borja. In that region of the Uruguay River, during those years, navigation was scarce, with only small passenger boats or rafts present. Nowadays, navigation is practically nil due to the presence of the international bridge. So, due to this, the strength was in land patrolling. To understand this story, I'm going to tell you a little at least about the detachments and their operation as Leonardo detailed it to me. The seat of the Santo Tome Prefectura is in the homonymous city of Corrientes, and has 4 detachments as a dependency, which today are called Prefecture Level 5, for being in charge of a non-commissioned officer and troops. The detachments in 1992 were Yohasa, Paso Hormiguero, Ramón Guarda, and Marinero Lorenzo Romero, these last 3 downstream from the city. At that time, one of the directives was that the subordinate officers, the first ranks, had to make rounds through the detachments and stay at least for a few days, and thus be able to check that everything is correct, maintenance of the building, weaponry, and communications equipment. Also accompany these days on patrols to the outstanding ones in the area. Leonardo specifically, despite being trained to command surface units, his passion was always the forest. He had a more police-like profile called within the prefecture as a war crazy. From now on, I'm going to tell you exactly what Leonardo's experience was like in the Correntino forest. That time we arrived at the outpost by river in an aluminum boat. We had to stay until we were pulled back a few days later by land. The outpost did not have grid power, but there was a generator that only turned on at night to charge the batteries of the walkie-talkies. There was no fan, let alone air conditioning. The heat was unbearable. We had a gas refrigerator, and the biggest luxury was having a mosquito net without any holes. The first day, we checked the tasks of the place and the documents, and that evening we had an early dinner, as the next day we had to go out on land patrol. Very early we equipped ourselves with everything necessary: water, flashlights, handy with charged batteries, salt, repellent, among other necessary elements for the Correntino Monte. Our weaponry was a standard Browning 9mm pistol, knife and machete, the latter not mandatory but necessary, and also shoulder weapons, FAL rifle and MP5 in my case. That morning we set out walking downstream, plowing through the cliffy coast. In this area, the abigato is very common. They are Brazilians who cross with boats or precarious canoes. They leave them anchored on the coast so they are not seen. They go into the bush to kill animals, they slaughter them and take the meat back to the other side. That day, luckily, the patrol was going on without any news. We walked for a long while until we came across something unusual, at least for me. We came across some crosses, some made of wood and others of wrought iron. It was a kind of makeshift cemetery with about 6 or 7 graves. It was at that moment that one of the officers accompanying me in a very serious and confident manner says, "Sir, let's clean up a bit before we continue." The area was low bush and about 15 meters from the river approximately. Being from the coast, I didn't find the idea of cleaning up this old cemetery strange. That's why, obviously, I agreed to the assistant's request. We started cleaning the area, removing fallen branches and cutting the tall grass and weeds that covered the crosses with machetes. It didn't take us long to finish, and before continuing to patrol, I noticed that the officer crossed himself and all of us there did the same. At that moment he looked at me, and while placing a cloth as a ribbon on one of the crosses, he says to me again, "Sir, we are going to mark the cemetery." This caught my attention, but I agreed to his request without questioning it. Then we continued on. The patrol lasted into the afternoon. I had canned minced meat for lunch. Since we didn't plan on spending the night in the mountains, we returned to the detachment. The return was similar. We alternated between walking in silence to avoid smugglers and chatting about various topics to get acquainted. Even though I held the rank of officer, my companions were the ones who truly had more knowledge of this forest. When we arrived at the outpost, Assistant Dos Santos, the person in charge, was waiting for us. When he saw us, he told us that dinner was already underway. Upon arrival, we disarmed and cleaned ourselves. Then we started drinking some mate while we waited for dinner, a good noodle stew. In the midst of a conversation on various topics, the petty officer accompanied me on patrol, along with another sailor. With a serious face and looking at Dos Santos, he said, "We found the cemetery." The person in charge looked at him and didn't say anything, but I perceived in his eyes some astonishment. They knew something I didn't. I never liked to be left with doubts, and that's why I interrupted them and asked, "What's going on with that cemetery?" The assistant Dos Santos looked at me immediately. He was silent for a few seconds as if looking for an answer, and he told me that he would go out with me the next day, that please don't ask him anymore, that he would tell me everything later. That was enough for me to stay calm, and after a pleasant dinner full of local anecdotes and also telling him about my city and my Entre Rios, we went to sleep, leaving only the guard awake. At dawn, this time also with the assistant Dos Santos, we walked along the shores downstream like the patrol the day before, but this time the patrol was handled by the non-commissioned officer. They wanted to show me something, but they wouldn't tell me what, and my mind was only thinking about this. And I wasn't paying attention to landmarks to avoid getting lost. At one point we all stopped. I had no idea what was going on. We were in the middle of the woods, and since I hadn't paid attention to the path, I didn't know where we were. The assistant tells me, "Look boss," and it was at that moment that the place seemed somewhat familiar to me, and he asked me, "Is this where they found the cemetery yesterday?" I quickly looked for the crosses and couldn't find any until I see on a dry one of the crosses the day before, but there was no grave anywhere. Seeing my surprised face, he told me, "Thank goodness that yesterday you were with Assistant Benitez, who knows about this topic." He told me a bit more about this and said that many patrols have come across the cemetery and that only those who know of its existence take some time to clean it, pray, cross themselves, and other forms of respect. He told me that he had to go out and search for patrols lost in the woods multiple times. Upon finding them and talking to them, it's always the same. They passed by a cemetery, but they continued on their way without stopping and showing respect. This strange place is Ramón Guarda's cemetery, and the belief says that if you find it and do not show respect towards these graves, it is very likely that it will not show you the way back to the detachment and lead you to get lost in the Monte Correntino. This legend is known by few people from the place more than anything, so it is a privilege to be able to know about it. Speaking with Leonardo, he was able to get information directly from the prefecture about the name of Ramón Guarda to know who he was. There are not many official data that assure why the detachment itself was called by this name. However, there are versions that assert that Ramón Guarda was a citizen of Brazilian origin who worked at the port customs of his country, and that once he retired from that activity, he settled on Argentine coasts, leading a solitary life dedicated to agriculture and livestock breeding in an area that locals would later call Paraje del Guarda Ramón or Paraje Ramón Guarda. In the year 1953, Prefectura Santo Tome installs the detachment and names it Ramón Guarda. Leave me a comment to let me know if you knew about this place, what you thought of the video and the legend of a cemetery, that if you come across it, I hope you show respect.